Some nights the stillness in a room feels different from silence. It is not empty. It simply has nowhere to be. If this feels like a good place to rest tonight, you're welcome to stay. Now let's drift. There is a question that almost never gets asked out loud because it feels too simple to matter. What is now? Not yesterday, not the next few minutes. Just this exact sliver of time, the one happening as these words reach you. It sounds like something with an obvious answer. It is not. Neuroscientists have observed that the brain does not experience time the way a clock does in one smooth, continuous line. Instead, it seems to gather the world in small batches, then stitch them together afterward into something that feels seamless. A blink, a breath, a few hundred milliseconds of sound. The mind collects these fragments and quietly assembles them into a story it calls the present moment, which means in a strange and gentle way that now is never really now. By the time a sound reaches awareness, by the time light lands somewhere behind the eyes and becomes an image, a small amount of time has already slipped by. Not enough to notice, just enough to matter if you think about it slowly late at night with nowhere else to be. Researchers have found that this gap, the space between something happening and the brain finally noticing it happen, changes depending on what kind of information is involved. Sound arrives to awareness a little faster than sight. Touch lands somewhere in between, and the brain, without ever asking permission, quietly smooths all of it into one experience so that a falling leaf seems to be seen and heard at the exact same instant, even though underneath it never quite was. It is a small kindness, really, the mind editing reality just enough to make it feel whole. There is a word some scientists use for this window of experience: the specious present. A present that feels solid, feels immediate, feels like it is happening exactly as it is happening, and yet is quietly built from moments that have already technically passed. It is a soft kind of illusion, not a lie exactly, more like the brain doing its best to keep up and doing it so well that most people never feel the seams. Some psychologists often note that this is part of why time feels so unreliable when we try to hold it too tightly. A long car ride at night can feel like it lasted a single breath. A short wait for something uncertain can feel endless. The clock on the wall never changes its pace, but the mind measuring it does constantly, quietly, without asking. It may be that this is the closest thing to proof that time as we live, it was never something happening entirely out there. Some of it is built in here somewhere behind the eyes, somewhere beneath thought. Studies indicate that even the smallest shifts in attention can stretch or shrink this feeling. A moment given full attention seems to widen. A moment passed in distraction seems to disappear before it was ever really there. As if presence itself is a kind of ingredient, something the mind adds to time to make it feel real, which might explain something many people notice but rarely say aloud. That some evenings feel long and slow, gentle enough to sink into, and other evenings vanish gone before they were truly lived. The hours were the same length. The self experiencing them was not. There is no urgency to any of this. No lesson waiting at the end of it, no conclusion needing to be reached tonight. Just a soft, ongoing question, one the body seems to carry more comfortably than the mind. What is now? Where does it begin? Where does it quietly end before the next one arrives to take its place? The mind quietly registers all of this without complaint. It has been doing this every second of every day of every year since before there were words for any of it. Assembling the present, letting it go, assembling the next one. Some scientists believe this rhythm, this constant unnoticed act of building and releasing moments, might be one of the oldest processes life ever learned. Long before there were thoughts about time, there were simply living things responding to it. Reacting to light, reacting to warmth, reacting to change, keeping some kind of quiet count without ever needing to know they were counting anything at all. And that count did not begin in the mind. It began somewhere much smaller. Somewhere so small it usually goes unnoticed entirely. Because underneath thought, underneath breath, underneath the soft weight of a body settling into rest, there are far tinier clocks still running. Ones that were never taught to keep time. Ones that simply always have. Every one of those tiny clocks lives somewhere unexpected, not in a single organ, not tucked away behind the eyes waiting for permission to run. They live inside the smallest unit of the body there is, a single cell. Researchers have found that nearly every cell in the human body carries its own quiet rhythm, a molecular loop that rises and falls roughly every 24 hours, whether or not that cell has ever seen daylight. A cell deep in the liver, a cell resting in the skin, a cell folded somewhere inside the heart. Each one seems to know in its own small ways something close to what time it is. It happens through a soft kind of chemistry. Certain proteins build up slowly inside a cell over the course of a day, then quietly break down again by night, only to begin building once more. Scientists sometimes call this the molecular clock, though it has no hands, no face, nothing that looks like a clock at all. Just a rhythm of appearing and fading, repeating itself with the patience that has lasted since long before there were eyes to read a sundial. What makes this feel almost impossible to believe is how independent it is. Cells removed from the body, placed alone in a dish far from sunlight, far from any signal of day or night, will often keep this same rhythm running for days on their own. As if the rhythm was never borrowed from the sun in the first place. As if it was something the cell was simply born already knowing. It seems that this kind of timekeeping is not something evolution invented once and handed down. It may be closer to something life kept rediscovering again and again in nearly every form it took. Bacteria, some of the oldest and simplest living things on this planet, show rhythms that rise and fall with the day. Plants open and close in patterns that continue for a while even in constant darkness, as though still listening for a sun that isn't there anymore. Fungus, algae, tiny organisms with no brain at all, and yet still somehow something like a memory of time. There is a quiet kind of comfort in that. Long before there was a mind to wonder about time, there was already something in the body keeping a kind of count, not thinking about the future, not remembering the past, just rising and falling gently the way tides do, without needing a reason. Neuroscientists have observed that in humans this scattered choir of tiny cellular clocks does not run entirely on its own. Somewhere near the centre of the brain, just above where the optic nerves cross, there is a very small cluster of cells that seems to act almost like a conductor. Not loud, not commanding, just quietly keeping the rest of the body roughly in step, the way a single instrument in an orchestra might hold a note the others can tune themselves against. This cluster listens mostly to light. Morning light reaching the eyes sends a soft signal outward, a kind of gentle nudge that tells the liver, the skin, the heart, the lungs, all of it roughly what time it is. But the cells were never entirely dependent on that light to begin with. They were already keeping their own rhythm before the signal ever arrived. The light does not create the clock. It only helps keep the many small clocks scattered across the body a little closer to the same page. What we understand so far suggests that this is part of why crossing several time zones can feel so strange in the body even after the eyes have adjusted to a new sky. The stomach may still expect dinner at an hour that no longer exists here. The heart may still rise and fall to a rhythm tuned to a city left behind. It is not confusion exactly. It is thousands of tiny clocks, each one honest, each one still, faithfully following the last rhythm it was shown, quietly waiting to be gently retaught. There is something almost tender about that. The body does not forget easily. It keeps time the way it keeps memory, softly, stubbornly, out of loyalty to whatever it learned first. Studies indicate that these rhythms reach further than most people ever imagine. Blood pressure rises and falls in a pattern across the day. Body temperature drifts down gently in the hours before sleep and eases back up before waking, often before the eyes have opened, as if some quiet part of the body already knew morning was close. Even the sensitivity to pain seems to shift slightly with the hour, and certain medicines work differently depending on when exactly they enter the body. Not because the medicine changes, because the body receiving it does. It may be that a person is never quite the same person biologically speaking at 3 in the afternoon as they are at 3 in the morning. Not in any way that changes who someone is. Just a soft, continuous drift, the way the tide is always the ocean, and yet never sits at exactly the same height twice. Psychologists often note that this rhythm reaches into the mind as well, not only the body. Alertness rises and falls in gentle waves across the day, and this has little to do with willpower or effort. There are simply hours when a mind is more inclined to focus, and hours when it quietly begins asking without words to rest. Fighting that rhythm too often can feel like paddling against a current that was never trying to cause harm. It was only ever trying to keep time. Evidence suggests that even mood follows something like a rhythm of its own, subtle, easy to miss, but there, a kind of emotional undertow that rises in the body a little before it ever reaches conscious thought. Long before someone can explain why an evening feels heavier or lighter than expected, some quiet chemical tide may have already been shifting beneath it. None of this asks to be understood all at once, it only asks to be noticed gently, the way one notices the sound of rain only after it has already been falling for some time. What feels strange in the softest way is that no cell was ever told to do this. No single cell decided on its own to start counting days, and yet somehow across trillions of them spread through skin and blood and bone, there is a kind of quiet agreement. A willingness to rise and fall together, mostly in step like a very large, very patient choir that has never once needed to rehearse. Scientists are still exploring how so many separate unthinking parts of the body manage to stay so gently synchronized without any single one of them fully in charge. It might be one of the softest mysteries hiding inside something as ordinary as a body lying still in the dark. And somewhere in that mystery is a strange, quiet detail worth sitting with for a moment. If every cell already carries something like a sense of time, held together by nothing louder than rhythm and light, then time itself may not only be something happening to the body, it may be something the body has been gently practicing cell by cell since the very first moment it began to live, which leads to a much older, much larger question. Not about cells anymore, not even about the body at all, because somewhere far beyond skin and blood and rhythm, physicists have been asking a quieter version of the very same thing. Not how the body keeps time, but whether time itself was ever as steady as fixed as it feels lying here in the dark. A second most people assume is a fixed thing. Small, exact, the same everywhere, always. A quiet unit that never bends, never stretches, never changes, no matter where it happens to fall. It seems that assumption, as comforting as it feels, is not quite true. Researchers have found that time does not move at the same pace everywhere in the universe. Not because clocks are imperfect, because time itself, according to physics, is not the fixed backdrop it appears to be. It is something closer to a fabric soft and responsive, capable of stretching in the presence of speed and again in the presence of gravity. This idea did not arrive easily. For a very long time, even among scientists, time was treated as something absolute. The same second ticking identically for everyone everywhere, regardless of what they were doing or where they stood. It was Albert Einstein in the early years of the last century who quietly suggested something stranger. That time is not one single river flowing the same way for everyone. It is more like many rivers, each one shaped slightly differently, depending on how fast something is moving and how close it sits to something massive. The brain tends to resist this at first. It feels wrong, almost impossible, the way very deep truths sometimes do. And yet it has been measured, tested, confirmed quietly again and again in ways that no longer leave much room for doubt. Here is one of the gentlest ways to hold it. High above the Earth, satellites circle the planet carrying extremely precise clocks, the same kind of technology that allows a phone to know exactly where it sits on a street, in a house, in a room. Those clocks experience two competing effects. Because the satellites move quickly, their clocks tick slightly slower than clocks on the ground. But because they also sit farther from Earth's gravity, in a place where gravity pulls a little less strongly, their clocks tick slightly faster. When both effects are combined, the clocks in orbit end up running faster than clocks down here by a very small amount. Something close to 38 microseconds each day. It sounds almost too small to matter. But left uncorrected, that tiny drift would cause location errors on the ground of several miles within a single day. So satellites are built with this correction already accounted for. Every time a phone quietly finds its way home in the dark, it is relying in some small way on the fact that time moves differently up there than it does down here. There is something oddly moving about that. A quiet reminder folded into ordinary technology that the ground beneath a sleeping body and the sky above it are not technically keeping the same time at all. Studies indicate that gravity is the gentler half of this story, though no less real. Time passes slightly slower, closer to something massive, and slightly faster farther away from it. A clock resting near the base of a mountain will in theory tick almost imperceptibly slower than a clock resting near its peak. Even a clock on the floor of a room ticks marginally slower than a clock resting on a shelf above it. The difference is far too small to notice in an ordinary lifetime, but it is there, quietly, whether anyone is measuring it or not. It may be that gravity in its own way is something like a very slow, very patient hand resting on time, pressing down just slightly wherever mass gathers, not stopping it, just softly slowing its pace the way a hand resting gently on a page can slow the turning without ever closing the book. What we understand so far suggests that speed behaves in a similar though separate way. The faster something moves, the more slowly time passes for it relative to something standing still. This is not a trick of perception. It is not an illusion created by motion. It appears to be a real property of how the universe is built. An astronaut spending significant time aboard a fast-moving spacecraft returns to Earth having aged by an almost unnoticeable fraction, less than the people who stayed behind. The difference in most real cases amounts to a matter of milliseconds, barely a breath, and yet the fact that it exists at all quietly reshapes something fundamental. It suggests that there is no single universal now shared equally by everyone in the cosmos. Each person, each object, each point of view carries its own slightly different version of the present, shaped by how fast it moves and how close it rests to something heavy enough to bend the space around it. Psychologists often note that this can feel disorienting to sit with because human experience is built entirely around the opposite assumption. That now is now everywhere for everyone, that the moment happening here is the same moment happening at the other side of the world at the same instant without exception. Physics very quietly suggests otherwise, and yet none of this changes what a night like this feels like. It does not make a slow breath any less real. It does not make the quiet weight of a body settling into rest any less true. It only means that the second in which that breath happens is not quite as fixed, as universal as it seems. It is something softer, something relative, something that bends ever so slightly around mass and motion the way water bends gently around whatever it happens to be poured over. Evidence suggests that at the very edges of this idea, near something as extreme as a black hole, the bending becomes far less subtle. Close enough to that kind of gravity, time would appear to slow dramatically to an outside observer, stretching seconds into something almost unrecognizable. From far away, someone falling towards such a place would seem to slow almost to stillness frozen at the edge. even as from their own perspective nothing strange would seem to be happening at all. It's one of the strangest agreements physics has ever made with itself. Two things can be true at once depending entirely on where someone happens to be standing. There is a quieter layer to this one that most people never consider resting just beneath everything gravity and speed do to a clock. Something that has less to do with the universe outside the body, and much more to do with the very small, very human sense of before and after cause and effect, one moment quietly following the next. Long before there was any equation to describe how time bends around gravity or speed, there was something far more ordinary, quietly doing something just as strange. Memory. It feels most of the time like a kind of recording, as though the mind simply presses a button somewhere and stores a moment exactly as it happened, ready to be replayed later untouched, unchanged. It is a comforting idea. It is also researchers have found not quite how memory actually works. Every time a memory is recalled, the brain does not retrieve it the way a file is opened. It rebuilds it. Piece by piece, mostly from fragments scattered across different regions, stitched back together, in the moment of remembering, almost like reassembling something from parts kept in separate drawers. And each time this happens, the memory becomes very slightly moldable, coloured ever so gently by the mood in the room, by what has happened since, by the simple act of being remembered at all. Neuroscientists have observed that this reconstruction is not a flaw in an otherwise perfect system. It appears to be the system itself. The brain was seemingly never built to preserve the past with perfect accuracy. It was built to make the past useful, flexible enough to serve the present, even if that means a memory quietly shifts a little more each time it is visited. There is something tender in that if it is allowed to settle slowly. A memory revisited softly enough, often enough, is not a fixed photograph gathering dust. It is closer to a small living thing still being gently shaped by the person carrying it. What we understand so far suggests that this rebuilding depends heavily on a part of the brain shaped like a small curved seahorse tucked deep within each side of the head, the hippocampus. It does not store memories permanently the way was once believed. Instead, it seems to act more like an index, a quiet map pointing toward where different fragments of a memory are kept elsewhere in the brain, pulling them together only when needed. This is part of why a single smell can summon an entire evening from years ago fully formed before there is time to consciously choose to remember it. Scent, more than most senses, is wired unusually close to memory and emotion. It does not politely announce itself. It simply arrives carrying a memory in with it uninvited and often unexpectedly gentle. Studies indicate that time itself is one of the trickiest things for memory to hold accurately. People are often very good at remembering what happened. They are often surprisingly poor at remembering exactly when. Two events that happen months apart can feel in memory as though they occurred side by side. A single afternoon full of unusual detail can stretch out in recollection to feel far longer than it truly was. It may be that memory does not measure time the way a clock does in even identical units. It measures it in density, in how much happened, how much was felt, how much attention was paid while it was happening. A quiet, uneventful week can compress into something that feels like a single day once it has passed. A short, vivid afternoon can expand in memory until it feels like it lasted much longer than the hours it actually held. This means in a soft and unexpected way that a life is not remembered in years. It is remembered in moments that mattered enough to leave a mark, with long stretches of ordinary time quietly folded down, small in between them, barely taking up any space at all. Psychologists often note that this is part of why childhood summers so often feel in memory impossibly long, while adult years seem to move faster with each passing one. It may have less to do with time speeding up and more to do with how much of it is spent encountering something new. A child's days are dense with first encounters, new smells, new sounds, new rooms never entered before, and the brain quietly cataloguing all of it stretches that time out in memory. An adult's days, softened by routine, often blur together with less to separate one from the next, and so they seem looking back to have passed more quickly than they were actually lived. There is no correction needed here, no lesson waiting underneath it. Only a gentle observation, the kind that arrives quietly at night, that time remembered and time lived were perhaps never quite the same thing to begin with. Evidence suggests that memory also reorders time more than most people realize, arranging events not strictly by when they occurred, but by how connected they feel to one another. Two moments that share a similar emotion, a similar place, a similar person, tend to sit closer together in memory regardless of how many months or years actually separated them, as though memory cares less about chronology and more about meaning. This is in its own way one of the softest kinds of evidence that the mind was never truly built to be a historian. It was built to be something closer to a quiet storyteller, gently arranging the past into a shape that makes sense of the present, even if the true order of events gets softened, blurred, or gently rearranged along the way. It seems that even the emotional tone of a memory can shift slightly over time, not because the event changes, but because the person remembering it does. A memory that once felt sharp and painful can with enough distance settle into something quieter, softer around the edges, almost unrecognizable from how it first felt to live through. Not because it is being forgotten, because it is being carried by someone who has in the meantime quietly continued to change. There is a strange comfort tucked inside the thought, one easy to miss in the middle of an ordinary day, but gentler to notice here in the stillness. The past is not fixed behind a person like a photograph on a wall. It moves along with them softly, almost imperceptibly, the way a shadow shifts shape throughout the day without ever fully leaving. The mind quietly registers all of this without ever needing to be asked. It's been rebuilding the past gently, continuously, for as long as there has been a self there to remember anything at all. And beneath even this, beneath the shifting shapes of memory and the soft, unreliable order of things once lived, there is another layer, quieter still. One that has less to do with remembering the past and more to do with simply feeling time pass right now in the body without needing to think about it at all. There is a quiet sense most people carry without ever naming it. A feeling somewhere beneath thought of how much time has passed since something happened. Not a glance at a clock, something closer to instinct. And it seems that instinct begins of all places inside the chest. Researchers have found that the body's own internal signals, heartbeat, breath, the subtle rise and fall of temperature beneath the skin, play a much larger role in the sense of time than most people realize. This quiet awareness of the body's internal state has a name, interoception, and it appears to be tangled more closely than expected with how time itself is felt. It works something like this. Each beat of the heart sends a small signal inward, one the brain registers below conscious awareness. Some scientists suggest that these signals may act almost like a very soft, very steady drumbeat one the mind uses without realizing it to help mark the passing of time, not by counting each beat, more by sensing the rhythm underneath everything else the way a hand resting on a chest might feel the pulse, without ever needing to count it aloud. This means that time at its most basic level may not be measured only by the mind. It may be measured in part by the body itself, quietly, continuously, long before a thought ever forms about how long something has taken. Studies indicate that when the heart beats a little faster, whether from movement, from warmth, from a sudden rush of feeling, time can seem to stretch subtly, taking on a slightly slower, thicker quality. When the body is calm, when the heart settles into a slow and even rhythm, time often seems to smooth out, to glide by with less friction, less resistance. As though the pace of the body and the pace of experienced time were never fully separate things to begin with. There is something soft in that thought worth letting settle for a moment. A racing heart does not just respond to time, it may quietly reshape how time is felt. And a slow, steady one like the kind settling into a body right now, resting somewhere warm and still, may be doing something gentle to time as well, without asking, without announcing it. Neuroscientists have observed that temperature plays its own quiet part in this. A body that runs slightly warmer tends to perceive time as moving a little faster than it actually is. A cooler body often does the opposite, sensing time as passing more slowly than the clock would suggest. This is part of why fever historically has sometimes come with a strange distortion of time minutes, feeling like hours or hours dissolving into what feels like minutes. The body in those moments is not lying, it is simply reading time through a different internal instrument than usual. It may be that the sense of time was never meant to be perfectly objective in the first place. It was built instead to be responsive, shaped by warmth, by rhythm, by whatever state the body happens to be resting in at any given moment. What we understand so far suggests that breath carries a similar, quieter influence. Long, slow exhales tend to calm the nervous system, and with that calm often comes a subtle softening in the felt pace of time. This is part of the reason a slow breath taken deliberately can feel like it gently widens a moment, giving it just a little more room to exist in. Not because the second itself changes, because the body measuring it has for a moment changed its own rhythm. There is a strange, tender symmetry hiding in this. The same breath that calms a racing heart may also be quietly stretching time itself, if only by a small private fraction felt by no one but the person breathing it. Evidence suggests that this internal sense of time is not the same for everyone, and not even the same within one person from day to day. People who are more attuned to their own internal signals, more aware of their own heartbeat, their own breath, their own subtle shifts in temperature, often report a more precise, more grounded sense of how much time has passed. Those less connected to these internal cues sometimes experience time as more slippery, harder to hold on to, easier to lose track of. It seems that paying gentle attention to the body, not with effort, not with strain, but simply noticing it resting, a quiet awareness on the slow rise and fall of breath may bring a person a little closer to their own sense of time. Not to control it, just to feel it a little more clearly, the way a hand resting lightly on water can feel a current it could never see from the shore. Psychologists often note that this bodily sense of time tends to fade first at the edges of sleep. As the heart rate slows, as breathing lengthens and deepens, as body temperature begins its own gentle nightly decline, the felt sense of time softens along with it. Minutes stop announcing themselves. The space between one thought and the next begins to widen quietly without resistance. This is not a malfunction. It may be one of the gentlest signs the body gives that it's beginning to let go of the need to track time at all. There is something almost like trust in that letting go. As though the body sensing it is safe enough to rest quietly decides that time for now does not need to be followed so closely. It can simply be felt loosely, the way one feels the shape of a room in the dark without needing to see its edges. It may be that this is the closest thing to what people mean when they say a certain kind of rest feels timeless. Not because time has stopped, because the body has quietly stopped counting it so carefully and has allowed itself instead to simply be inside it. And beneath even this soft bodily sense of time, there is another layer, still one that rarely announces itself during the day, but grows a little louder toward an evening and quieter still toward sleep. A sense that seems to belong to no single part of the body at all, and yet somehow quietly answers to all of it at once. There is a kind of knowing that never asks permission from thought. It simply happens quietly underneath conscious awareness long before a person is aware anything was decided at all. Researchers have found that a surprising amount of the timing in daily life is handled below the surface of conscious thought. The body does not wait for a decision to begin preparing for sleep or for waking or for hunger. It begins these preparations quietly in advance, often hours before the mind notices anything has changed. One of the clearest examples of this involves a hormone called melatonin. As evening approaches, a small structure deep in the brain, sensing the fading of daylight through signals sent from the eyes, begins releasing this hormone into the bloodstream, gently signaling to the rest of the body that night is coming. This does not require any conscious awareness of the time. It happens whether or not a person is watching a clock, whether or not they are even aware the sun has begun to set. The body already knows in its own quiet language long before the mind catches up. It seems that awareness, in this sense, is often the last to find out. The subconscious mind appears to track time, continuously adjusting hormones, temperature and alertness in the background, the way a house might quietly settle and creak as it cools in the evening, without anyone needing to instruct it to do so. Studies indicate that even the ability to awake at a specific time without an alarm may draw on this same hidden sense. Some research has found that people who intend to wake at a particular hour show a rise in a stress-related hormone called cortisol shortly before their intended time, even while still deeply asleep, as though some quiet part of the mind had been counting all along unnoticed, preparing the body to surface at just the right moment. There is something almost moving in that idea. A sleeping mind seemingly unconscious, still faithfully keeping a promise made the night before without ever needing to be reminded. Neuroscientists have observed that this hidden sense of timing reaches even further into small everyday movements that feel automatic. The gentle way a hand reaches for a glass of water without needing to calculate the distance. The steady pace of footsteps on a familiar path. These movements are often timed and coordinated well before conscious thought fully catches up with them. Signals in the brain related to movement have been measured beginning to build quietly, a fraction of a second before a person becomes consciously aware they intended to move at all. This does not mean choice is an illusion, it suggests something gentler. That much of the mind's timing operates a little like a musician who has played a piece so many times that the fingers seem to know the next note before conscious thought fully arrives to confirm it. The body leads softly, and awareness follows close behind, so close that most of the time no gap is ever felt at all. It may be that consciousness was never meant to run the show entirely alone. It may be more like a passenger seated closely enough to feel every turn, while something older, quieter, and remarkably competent handles much of the actual timing underneath. What we understand so far suggests that this hidden sense of time does not disappear, even when the usual cues, daylight, mealtimes, clocks are removed entirely. In certain studies, participants living for weeks in spaces without windows or clocks cut off from any signal of day or night still fell into a roughly repeating rhythm of waking and sleeping close to but not exactly 24 hours. Their conscious minds had no idea what time it was. Some quieter part of them seemed to know anyway. There is a soft kind of reassurance folded into that. Even stripped of every outside signal, even in the dark, even without a single clock in sight, the body does not lose track of time completely. It simply falls back on something older, something that was never dependent on daylight or numbers in the first place. Evidence suggests that people who are blind from birth often experience this most clearly of all. Even without ever having perceived light directly, many still maintain a roughly day-length rhythm, guided by a subtle specialized set of light-sensitive cells in the eye that have nothing to do with seeing images and everything to do with simply registering the presence of light. The mind in these cases seems to be listening for daylight through a channel that was never really about sight to begin with, just about rhythm, just about knowing in some quiet way that a day has turned. It seems that timing at its most essential was never fully entrusted to conscious thought. It was placed somewhere deeper and steadier, somewhere unlikely to forget, unlikely to be distracted, unlikely to lose count even when everything else in the mind grows tired or unsure. Psychologists often note that this is part of why certain routines, once deeply practiced, continue almost effortlessly even during periods of stress or distraction. Brushing teeth, locking a door, settling into a familiar chair at a familiar hour. The conscious mind may be elsewhere entirely, and yet the body continues on schedule gently, faithfully, without needing supervision. There is a quieter layer to this one that most people never consider, because if so much of timing happens beneath awareness guided by rhythms the conscious mind never chose and barely notices, then perhaps time was never something the mind was meant to control at all. Perhaps it was only ever something the mind was meant to feel softly from a slight distance, the way one feels the motion of a boat without needing to understand the current carrying it. And if that is true, then somewhere close to this hidden subconscious sense of time, there may be another sense sitting even closer to the surface. Not quite conscious thought, not quite instinct either. Something gentler, quieter that seems to simply know without explanation exactly when a moment is right. There is a particular kind of certainty that arrives without evidence. A sense that exactly enough time has passed without ever glancing at a clock to confirm it. Most people have felt it and rarely stop to wonder where it comes from. Scientists suggest that this quiet ability, sensing the passage of short stretches of time without counting or measuring, deserves its own name separate from the other senses. Chronoception, not sight, not sound, not touch, but something closer to an inward sense folded quietly among the others, rarely noticed until it is tested. It seems that this sense does not live in one single place inside the brain, the way sight relies mostly on the eyes or hearing relies mostly on the ears. Instead, evidence suggests that the sense of time draws on a wide, loosely connected network, stretching across regions involved in movement, attention, and rhythm. There is no single clock hiding somewhere in the skull. There is instead something more like a quiet collaboration, many parts working together, offering their own small contribution to a feeling that only makes sense once assembled. One region that appears often in this collaboration sits deep near the center of the brain involved in movement and coordination, the same area responsible for the smooth practice motion of a hand reaching for something familiar in the dark. Researchers have found that this same region also seems to help track short intervals of time, as though movement and time were never entirely separate processes to begin with, but two closely related rhythms learned and refined together. This might explain something oddly familiar. The way tapping a rhythm with a finger can help hold a steady sense of time, almost like anchoring an inward feeling to something small and physical. As though time difficult to hold in thought alone becomes a little easier to feel once it is given something to move against. Neuroscientists have observed that this intuitive sense of timing tends to be remarkably good over short intervals, seconds, single minutes, small stretches easily, compared to the felt rhythm of a heartbeat or a breath. But it grows far less reliable as intervals stretch longer past several minutes into hours. Over longer periods, intuition quietly gives way to something closer to memory, to context, to the position of light in a window, or a general sense of how much has been done since the day began. It may be that intuition about time was never meant to handle long stretches gracefully. It seems built instead for the near and immediate, for judging whether a pot has been simmering too long, or whether enough silence has passed to comfortably speak again. A gentle practical sense tuned for small moments rather than sweeping spans of time. Psychologists often note that this intuitive timing sharpens with practice in ways that feel almost like an unconscious skill. Musicians, for example, often develop an unusually precise internal sense of short durations, able to feel the length of a pause, a rest, a held note, with an accuracy that would be difficult to explain through counting alone. It is not memorized. It is something closer to trained instinct, refined, slowly repetition after repetition, until it settles below conscious thought entirely. There is something quietly beautiful in that idea. that a sense as intangible as time can be shaped, softened, made more precise simply through gentle repeated attention, the same way a hand becomes steadier, the more often it is trusted to do something delicate. Studies indicate that emotion plays its own quiet role in how accurately this intuitive sense performs. A calm, settled state tends to support a more stable, reliable feeling for time. A distracted or anxious state tends to distort it, sometimes compressing it, sometimes stretching it, depending on what exactly is drawing the attention away. This is part of why waiting for something uncertain can feel far longer than waiting for something familiar and expected, even when the clock insists both waits were exactly the same length. It seems that intuition about time listens closely to the emotional weather of the moment it is trying to measure. Not deliberately, not with any intention to deceive, it simply cannot fully separate itself from how a moment feels while it is happening. What we understand so far suggests that this intuitive sense also depends heavily on attention in a very particular way. A task requiring close focus tends to make time feel like it passed quickly in the moment, and yet strangely feel long when remembered afterward. A task involving very little to focus on tends to feel slow while it is happening, and yet feel short in memory once it has ended, as though there are two separate senses of time living side by side, one felt in the moment, one felt in reflection, and they rarely agree with each other completely. There is something gently disorienting about that worth sitting with rather than solving. An evening can feel endless while it is happening, and yet only a day later seem to have passed in an instant. Both feelings are true. Neither one cancels the other out. They are simply two different instruments, both quietly measuring the same stretch of time and arriving at two different answers. Evidence suggests that this intuitive sense of time may begin developing very early, well before a child ever learns to read a clock or understand the concept of an hour. Even very young children show a rough, instinctive sense of before and after, of longer and shorter long before they have any formal understanding of numbers or units, as though this sense arrives quietly with life itself rather than being taught something closer to an inheritance than a lesson. It may be that intuition in this sense is not a lesser or less reliable form of knowing time. It may simply be an older one, something that existed long before clocks, long before language for time even existed, sensed instead through rhythm, movement, breath, and the quiet accumulation of small felt moments. There is a soft kind of trust worth extending to this sense, the same trust extended to a hand that reaches for a familiar switch in the dark without needing to see it first. It had been practicing quietly every day for an entire lifetime, and close beside this quiet sense of when resting almost in the same soft space there is something else. Not concerned with measuring time at all, but with how time feels when it is touched by something stronger. A feeling, a sudden widening or a sudden collapse depending entirely on what the heart happens to be doing at the time. There is a moment almost everyone carries somewhere quietly inside them. A sudden swerve on an empty road, a glass slipping from a hand before it shatters. A single second that looking back seemed to hold far more than a single second should have been able to hold. Researchers have found that moments of intense feeling, especially fear, but also wonder, awe, and sudden surprise often feel as though they lasted much longer than they actually did. Not because time itself slowed down, because something in the way those moments were experienced and later remembered changed how much time seemed to fit inside them. It seems that this begins with a small almond-shaped structure deep within the brain, called the amygdala, closely tied to emotion, and especially attentive to anything that feels sudden or important. When it senses something significant happening, it appears to prompt the brain into a heightened state of attention, taking in far more detail than usual, far more quickly than usual, almost as if trying to capture every possible piece of a moment that might matter. This does not mean the brain is somehow processing faster in real time. What we understand so far suggests something gentler and stranger. The brain is not speeding up, It is simply recording more richly, laying down a denser, more detailed memory of that single stretch of time than it would for an ordinary, uneventful one. And because memory, more than any clock, is how a moment's length gets judged afterward, a memory packed unusually full of detail tends to feel later as though it must have taken longer to happen. The mind measures time in hindsight not by seconds, but by how much there was to remember. There is something quietly moving in that idea. A moment does not need to bend the actual laws of physics to feel eternal. It only needs to be lived for just an instant with complete and total attention. Neuroscientists have observed that this effect can be studied in surprisingly careful ways. In one well-known kind of experiment, people are placed on a fast, safe, but genuinely frightening amusement ride while wearing a small device that flashes numbers too quickly for the eye to comfortably read under normal circumstances. If time truly slowed down during fear in the way it often feels like it does, those flashing numbers should become easier to read as the brain, moving faster, catches details it would otherwise miss. They do not become easier to read. Studies indicate that people undergoing the frightening experience perform no better at catching the flashing numbers than they do in a calm state, which suggests something subtle and important. The moment did not actually contain more real time or grant a kind of temporary superhuman perception. It only felt afterward, once remembered as though it had. It may be that the sensation of a stretched moment is not something happening while a person is inside it. It is something built quietly afterward in the careful, detailed memory it leaves behind. This changes very little about how real the feeling is. A moment recalled as long, vivid, and impossibly slow does not feel any less true simply because technically it passed at the same ordinary pace as everything else. Some kinds of truth are not about what a clock would confirm. They are about what a memory honestly and vividly chooses to hold on to. Psychologists often note that this dense, heightened kind of memory tends to fade differently than ordinary memory as well. Emotionally intense moments are often remembered with unusual clarity for a very long time, sometimes years, sometimes an entire lifetime, while countless ordinary hours quietly slip away without a trace. This is part of why certain single afternoons can be recalled in vivid detail decades later, while entire uneventful months lived not long before are barely remembered at all. There is a soft kind of fairness hidden in this, even if it rarely feels fair in the moment. The mind seems to spend its limited memory carefully saving its richest, most detailed record for the moments that mattered most, and letting the rest of ordinary time pass gently without needing to be kept. Evidence suggests that this heightened sense of time is not limited only to fear. Moments of genuine wonder tend to produce something remarkably similar. Standing beneath a very large, unfamiliar sky or witnessing something vast and difficult to fully comprehend tends to activate a similar kind of heightened attention, the mind slowing down, not out of danger, but out of sheer quiet astonishment. This particular feeling has its own gentle name among some researchers, awe, and it appears to leave behind memories every bit as dense and vivid as fear does without any of fear's discomfort attached. It seems that the brain does not fully separate the wonderful from the frightening, at least not in how carefully it chooses to remember them. Both in their own way register as unusually significant. Both earn a closer, richer kind of attention, and both afterward tend to feel as though they lasted far longer than the clock would ever admit. There is something gentle to notice in that, something almost encouraging if allowed to settle slowly. A life does not need constant excitement to feel long and full in memory. It only needs occasional moments of genuine attention, genuine wonder, genuine presence scattered here and there among the ordinary. Those are the moments memory tends to hold on to, tightly stretching them out afterward, quietly, generously, far beyond their original length. It may be that the fastest way to make a life feel long in the softest sense of the word is not by filling it with more hours, It is by noticing occasionally fully the ones already there. Evidence suggests that even very small moments of unexpected beauty, a certain slant of light and unfamiliar sound at just the right pitch, can trigger this same gentle widening of attention, even without any real danger, without any grand or sweeping scale involved. The mind does not require something enormous to feel a sense of wonder. It only requires something noticed closely enough to feel for just a moment unusually alive. There is a strange soft comfort in realizing that emotion, more than any actual bending of physics, is often responsible for time's strangest tricks. The universe outside remains steady, mostly unmoved. It is the felt experience within, shaped by attention, by feeling, by how closely a moment was witnessed, that quietly stretches or compresses around it. And this too seems to reach beyond any single mind existing alone, sensing time entirely by itself. Because emotion and the moments it stretches and holds on to rarely happen in complete isolation. Long before there were clocks to compare, there were people sitting close together in the dark, quietly sensing time in ways that somehow gently, without words, began to align. There is something quietly remarkable that happens between two people sitting close together for long enough in comfortable silence with nowhere else they need to be. Without either one trying, without either one noticing, their bodies slowly begin to fall into step with one another. Researchers have found that when two people spend time together, especially in calm, unhurried settings, their heart rates can gradually begin to synchronize, rising and falling in patterns that echo each other more closely than chance alone would predict. Their breathing too often drifts into a similar rhythm, one person's exhale settling near the other's without either one consciously adjusting anything at all. This phenomenon has a gentle name among those who study it: physiological synchrony. It appears to happen not only between people who know each other well, but sometimes between strangers simply from sharing space, shared attention, or a shared quiet task for long enough. It seems that the body is in some very real sense always listening to the bodies nearby, not through words, not through any deliberate signal, just through presence, through proximity, through the simple wordless fact of being near someone else long enough for two separate rhythms to begin softening into something closer to one. Neuroscientists have observed that this synchrony extends beyond the body's outer rhythms into the brain itself. Using devices that measure brain activity in real time, researchers have found that people engaged in shared attention, listening to the same story, watching the same quiet scene unfold, sometimes show strikingly similar patterns of brain activity rising and falling together, almost as if their minds were quietly reading the same passage of time in a similar way. This does not mean two minds become the same or lose their individual sense of self. It suggests something softer. That attention, when shared closely enough, can gently pull two separate experiences of time into a kind of loose temporary alignment. Two people listening to the same words may for a little while be feeling time pass in a strangely similar way. There is something tender in imagining that listening to the same story together in the dark is not only a shared activity, it may be in some small and quiet way a shared experience of time itself. Studies indicate that this kind of synchrony tends to deepen with familiarity and trust. People who feel emotionally close to one another often show stronger alignment in heart rate and breathing than strangers do, particularly during moments of shared calm, shared comfort, or shared vulnerability. It may be there that closeness is not only a feeling, it may also be quite literally a kind of rhythm. Two bodies learn to share the more time they spend near each other. This offers a soft, unexpected way of understanding something many people have felt but rarely put into words. The particular comfort of simply being near someone trusted even in silence, even without conversation. Perhaps some part of that comfort comes from something as simple and as profound as two hearts quietly settling into a similar pace. What we understand so far suggests that this kind of bodily connection may reach back much further than modern relationships, further even than language itself. Some researchers propose that synchronized rhythm, shared heartbeat, shared breathing, shared movement may have played a quiet role in how early humans formed bonds and cooperated long before complex speech existed. Group activities involving shared rhythm, walking together, working together, resting together near a fire, may have helped synchronize the bodies of those involved, deepening a sense of connection that words alone could not have created. It may be that the comfort of shared rhythm is one of the oldest forms of closeness there is, older than conversation, older than shared memory, something written quietly into the body itself long before there were words to describe what it felt like. Evidence suggests that even something as simple as walking in step with another person can create a subtle sense of increased trust and cooperation afterward, more so than walking at mismatched paces. As though the simple physical act of sharing a rhythm gently primes the mind to feel closer to whoever it was shared with. There is something almost startling in how simple this is once it is noticed. No conversation required, no shared history necessary, just footsteps falling into the same soft pattern, quietly building a sense of togetherness that neither person consciously chose to create. Psychologists often note that this synchrony may also explain part of why certain shared silences feel so comfortable while others feel oddly tense. A silence shared with someone whose rhythm has gently aligned with one's own often feels calm, easy, undemanding. A silence shared with someone whose rhythm remains out of step can feel without any clear reason why subtly uneasy. The mind may be sensing something the conscious thoughts never quite name. Whether the bodies present are, in this quiet moment, moving through time together, or simply moving through it side by side. It seems that time then is not only something happening privately inside a single body, a single mind. It may also be something quietly shared, borrowed and softened between people, especially those who spend enough gentle time near one another to let their separate rhythms drift into something closer to one. The mind, it seems, has been keeping something still and patient all along, waiting quietly beneath every conversation, every shared silence, every night spent near someone trusted. Not a memory, not a feeling exactly. Something closer to a rhythm old and steady that every living thing seems to carry whether or not it ever learns to notice it. And perhaps time has never really been counting seconds at all, but something quieter that living things have always carried inside them, a rhythm reaching far beyond any single heartbeat, any single mind resting instead in something larger, slower, and far more patient than anyone lying still in the dark tonight might expect. That larger, slower rhythm shared between the people is only one layer of something even older, something that continues quietly whether another person is near or not. A rhythm running beneath waking thought itself, rising and falling all day long, whether it is ever noticed or not. Researchers have found that the mind does not remain at one steady level of alertness throughout the day. Instead, it moves through a repeating pattern, cycling gently between sharper focus and softer, more drifting states of awareness roughly every 90 minutes or so. This pattern has a name among those who study it: the ultradian rhythm. Shorter than the wide daily cycle of waking and sleeping, but longer than a single breath or heartbeat tucked quietly in between. It seems that during the part of each of these cycles, attention feels crisp, easy to direct, capable of holding steady on a single task without much resistance. And then gradually, without any clear cause, focus begins to soften. Thoughts start to wander. The mind seems to ask quietly without words for a small rest, even if the body remains busy, even if there is no obvious reason to slow down at all. This shifting is not a flaw in concentration. What we understand so far suggests it may be closer to a built-in rhythm of the mind itself, similar in some ways to breathing or to a heartbeat, except stretched out over a much longer, much gentler span of time. There is something quietly reassuring in that. The drifting feeling that sometimes arrives in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, the sense of thoughts loosening, wandering somewhere softer, may not be a lapse at all. It may simply be the mind following its own old rhythm, asking gently to be allowed to rest for a little while before returning to focus again. Neuroscientists have observed that this same rhythm continues in a quieter form even during sleep. Throughout the night, the brain moves through repeating cycles roughly 90 minutes each, shifting between lighter and deeper stages of rest and periods where the eyes move rapidly beneath closed lids, often accompanied by dreaming. This entire pattern, awake or asleep, seems to follow the same underlying rhythm, simply expressed differently depending on whether the body happens to be resting or moving through the day. It may be that consciousness itself was never meant to remain at a single constant level from morning until night. It seems built instead to rise and fall continuously the way tides rise and fall along a shore, never staying fully high, never staying fully low, always somewhere quietly in between. Studies indicate that brain activity itself changes shape across these different states, measurable in the form of electrical waves moving through the brain at different speeds. Faster, more tightly packed waves tend to appear during focused, alert thought. Slower, more spread out waves tend to appear during rest daydreaming, or the early lighter stages of sleep. And during the very deepest stages of sleep, the waves slow even further, becoming long, heavy, and unusually synchronized, as though the entire brain for a little while begins moving together in one broad, unhurried rhythm. This is part of why the deepest stages of sleep feel upon waking almost entirely empty of time. The mind during those hours is not absent. It is simply moving so slowly, so evenly, that very little of it remains available afterwards to be remembered as distinct moments. There is something gentle in imagining that somewhere in the middle of the night the mind slows down enough to nearly stop measuring time at all, resting instead in something closer to a single long, unbroken wave. Evidence suggests that these same rhythms may influence far more than focus and sleep. Some researchers propose that the 90-minute cycle also shapes subtler things like mood, appetite, even the tendency toward daydreaming, each drifting gently in and out of the foreground as the cycle continues quietly underneath conscious awareness. A sudden pull toward imagination in the middle of a task, a quiet loss of appetite followed later by hunger may not be random. It may be one small part of a much older rhythm continuing steadily whether it is noticed or not. Psychologists often note that working with this rhythm rather than against it often feels far gentler than forcing constant unbroken focus throughout an entire day. Short periods of rest taken naturally when the mind begins to soften seem to align comfortably with what the brain appears to be doing anyway, quietly beneath the surface whether permission is given or not. It seems that the mind was never built for a single flat, unchanging kind of attention stretching evenly from morning until night. It seems built instead for something closer to breathing, rising, falling, resting, rising again, a long, unhurried rhythm repeated patiently without needing to be told to continue. There is a soft kind of comfort in recognizing that even wakefulness has its own quiet tides, that the drifting, wandering feeling arriving right now in the stillness of this late hour is not separate from focus, not opposed to it, but simply another gentle phase of the very same rhythm that has been rising and falling patiently since the very first morning this mind ever opened its eyes. And as this particular tide continues to lower gently without any need to resist it, there is another threshold not far ahead. A place where this same old rhythm slows even further, where the waves inside the mind grow long and even, and where time in its most familiar sense begins to loosen its hold almost entirely. Somewhere past that threshold in the deepest hours of the night, time behaves in a way almost nothing else in daily life prepares a person for. It does not simply slow down. In certain stretches of sleep, it seems to disappear almost entirely, leaving very little behind for the waking mind to measure afterward. Researchers have found that people are often remarkably poor at judging how long they have slept, especially after the deepest stages of the night. A person might wake believing only a short while has passed, only to discover that several hours have quietly gone by. Or the reverse might happen, a long restless feeling stretching what was actually a short nap into something that felt upon waking far longer than it truly was. It seems this happens because the deepest stage of sleep, sometimes called slow-wave sleep, involves very little of the kind of brain activity usually needed to form clear retrievable memories. During ordinary waking hours, the brain is almost constantly laying down small fragments of experience, one moment linked gently to the next, building the sense of a continuous timeline. In the deepest part of sleep, much of this quiet record-keeping appears to pause. Time still passes. The body still rests within it, but very little of it is captured in a way the waking mind can later look back on. There is something soft, almost forgiving in that idea, that certain hours of the night are not lost carelessly, but are simply allowed to pass without needing to be remembered at all. As though some part of the mind understands that not every hour needs to leave a mark behind. Neuroscientists have observed that dreaming complicates the sense of time even further, particularly during the stage of sleep known for vivid story-like dreams, when the eyes move rapidly beneath closed lids. Time within a dream often behaves nothing like time in waking life. A dream lasting only a few real minutes can feel, while inside it, like it's stretched across an entire day, filled with long conversations, entire journeys, sequences of events that would take hours to unfold if they were truly lived rather than dreamed. It may be that the dreaming mind is not concerned with pacing itself the way the waking mind is. Without the steady external cues of daylight clocks or ongoing conversation, time inside a dream seems to bend freely, compressing or stretching according to whatever the unfolding story requires, rather than any real external second ticking by. This offers a strange, gentle kind of freedom worth noticing softly rather than analysing too closely. Somewhere in an ordinary night's sleep, a mind at rest may quietly live through experiences that feel internally far longer than the night containing them. A brief spell of dreaming might hold what feels like an entire lifetime's worth of small moments and then dissolve in an instant the second the eyes happen to open. Studies indicate that certain other unusual states also seem to loosen the mind's grip on time